Scene 4 unfolds as a study in emotional rupture and unexpected refuge, beginning not with romance but with exhaustion, frustration, and the familiar chaos of a woman reaching the end of her coping capacity, as Sheena's day collapses, through a cascade of small failures that feel enormous precisely because they arrive when she has no remaining margin for grace. And the malfunctioning car stranded in front of Natalie's driveway becomes the central metaphor of the scene, a literal breakdown that mirrors Sheena's internal state and her relational impasse, situating her at a threshold where motion has ceased and some form of intervention, whether mechanical, emotional, or interpersonal, becomes unavoidable, and the dialogue's sharpness and repetition convey panic rather than melodrama, emphasizing how women under stress are often dismissed as overreacting even as their circumstances reveal genuine precarity, which is compounded by Sheena's awareness of being late, of having an antagonistic boss, of having just exited a relationship that offered neither safety nor compassion, and of being cut off from resources as basic as a working phone, all of which reflect a broader cultural pattern in which women are expected to remain functional, polite, and apologetic even when systems and relationships have failed them. And it is telling that Sheena apologizes repeatedly for needing help, enacting a learned reflex that many women will recognize, where asking for assistance feels like an imposition rather than a reasonable response to vulnerability. And Natalie's initial guardedness, her reluctance and skepticism, similarly reflects the social conditioning that teaches women to protect themselves by limiting openness, especially to strangers, particularly in a culture where women's safety is framed as an individual responsibility rather than a collective one. Yet the scene carefully avoids villainizing either woman for these instincts, instead presenting their hesitations as understandable survival strategies shaped by experience rather than personal failings. And when Natalie ultimately allows Sheena to use her phone, the gesture is framed not as heroic but as quietly humane, a moment of pragmatic solidarity that signals the film's commitment to portraying women's connections as grounded in everyday acts of care rather than dramatic declarations. And this understated beginning establishes the ethical tone of the scene, in which intimacy emerges through listening, recognition, and shared vulnerability rather than through spectacle or fantasy. And as Sheena's phone call unfolds, the intrusion of her former partner's voice into the space underscores the lingering power of emotionally abusive dynamics, particularly how control and surveillance can persist even after a relationship has ostensibly ended. And the language used against her, dismissive and accusatory, reflects a common pattern in which women's emotional experiences are minimized or reframed as moral failings, especially when those experiences involve same-gender intimacy that men interpret through insecurity or entitlement. And Natalie's response to witnessing this exchange is significant not because it is dramatic, but because it is grounded in recognition, as she names the behavior as abusive without sensationalism, drawing on her own lived experience to validate Sheena's distress. And this mutual recognition functions as a cornerstone of queer women's relational cultures, where shared stories of harm and survival often create the conditions for trust, mentorship, and the formation of chosen family. And the scene's shift from the driveway into the interior of Natalie's home marks a transition not only of physical space, but of emotional register, as the domestic setting becomes a site of safety rather than confinement, challenging the traditional association of the home with heterosexual coupledom, and instead reframing it as a potential refuge for women supporting one another. And Natalie's assurance that Sheena is safe is delivered without grandiosity, emphasizing steadiness over dominance, which is crucial in a narrative that seeks to avoid replicating power imbalances even as it acknowledges disparities in experience, resources, and confidence between the two women. And the subsequent conversation allows Sheena to articulate her confusion, fear, and sense of disorientation in the aftermath of being cast out of a relationship that had structured her identity and social world, illustrating how heterosexual partnerships often function as default frameworks through which women are expected to organize their lives, even when those partnerships are harmful. And Sheena's uncertainty about what comes next reflects a broader existential anxiety, familiar to many women who have been taught to measure success and stability through attachment to men, leaving them ill-prepared to imagine futures that center their own autonomy, desires, and capacities. And Natalie's role in this exchange is carefully constructed as both empathetic and aspirational, offering not a rescue, but a model of self-sufficiency and resilience that reframes independence as achievable rather than isolating. And by sharing her own history of being displaced, insulted, and left without resources, Natalie situates herself not above Sheena but alongside her, emphasizing continuity rather than hierarchy, which is particularly resonant within queer women's communities where mentorship often emerges organically through shared narratives rather than formal authority. And the film's refusal to sensationalize the moment when Natalie suggests alternative possibilities for intimacy is notable, as the suggestion is framed not as seduction but as an opening, an invitation to consider forms of connection that have been culturally marginalized or rendered invisible. And Sheena's hesitation is treated with respect, acknowledging the internalized fears, social taboos, and ethical concerns that accompany such Moments of self-recognition, especially for women whose previous explorations of desire have been met with punishment or ridicule, and this hesitation functions as an important counterpoint to narratives that portray queer awakening as sudden or uncomplicated, instead honoring the slow, negotiated process through which women come to understand their own emotional landscapes in contexts that have not provided them with affirming language or models. And the emphasis on safety throughout the scene serves as both a thematic anchor and a political statement, foregrounding the reality that for many women, especially queer women, intimacy is inseparable from considerations of risk, security, and trust, and by centering emotional safety rather than physical escalation, the film resists the tendency to eroticize vulnerability or to frame women's connections as inherently transgressive, insisting instead on their ethical seriousness and emotional depth, and this approach allows the scene to resonate beyond lesbian audiences, speaking to women more broadly who may recognize the exhaustion of emotional labor, the fear of starting over, and the longing for spaces where they are not required to perform resilience or desirability. And the dialogue's focus on confusion rather than certainty underscores a key insight of the film, that becoming oneself is not a linear progression, but an ongoing negotiation shaped by relationships, social pressures, and internalized expectations. And Natalie's calm presence offers a counter-narrative to the idea that fulfillment must be earned through endurance or conformity, suggesting instead that recognition, care, and shared understanding can serve as foundations for new forms of belonging. And the scene's power lies in its restraint, in its refusal to resolve Sheena's uncertainty or to define the relationship between the women in fixed terms, thereby honoring the ambiguity that characterizes many real-world experiences of emotional awakening. Particularly for women navigating the boundaries between friendship, mentorship, and desire in environments that scrutinize and categorize their interactions. And this ambiguity is not presented as confusion to be corrected, but as a space of possibility, where new understandings of self and connection can emerge without being immediately named or justified. And by situating this exchange within the aftermath of heterosexual breakdown, the film critiques the cultural narrative that positions men as gateways to legitimacy and stability, offering instead a vision of women supporting one another through transition, loss, and self-discovery. And the scene's attention to language, especially the harm inflicted through words, and the healing offered through careful listening, reinforces the idea that emotional intimacy is constructed through communication rather than action, through the willingness to sit with discomfort and uncertainty rather than to rush toward resolution. And in doing so, the film aligns itself with a tradition of queer storytelling that privileges interiority over plot, ethical complexity over titillation, and recognition over conquest. And this alignment is further evident in the way Natalie's suggestion of alternative relational possibilities is framed as experiential rather than prescriptive, inviting Sheena to explore what feels natural, rather than imposing an identity or outcome upon her, which reflects an ethic of consent and self-determination that is central to healthy queer relationships. And the scene thus functions as both a narrative moment and a broader commentary on how women can reclaim agency in the wake of relational harm, not by replicating structures of control, but by cultivating environments of trust, patience, and mutual respect. And the film's commitment to portraying lesbian intimacy as emotionally grounded, rather than sensational challenges, persistent cultural discomfort with women's love for one another, a discomfort rooted in patriarchal anxieties about female autonomy and the erosion of male centrality, and by depicting women finding solace, understanding, and potential connection outside of heterosexual frameworks. The scene resists both erasure and fetishization, insisting on the legitimacy of women-centered bonds as sites of meaning and growth. And this insistence is particularly significant in a media landscape that often oscillates between ignoring lesbian relationships entirely or reducing them to spectacle, leaving little room for nuanced explorations of how women actually experience desire, fear, and self-recognition. And the quiet resilience of the scene, its focus on listening, shared experience, and the gradual rebuilding of trust, positions it as a meaningful contribution to conversations about visibility and representation, offering viewers a mirror rather than a fantasy. And for queer women especially, the scene may resonate as an affirmation of the ways mentorship, empathy, and emotional honesty can function as pathways to self-understanding, even when those pathways are fraught with doubt and hesitation. And for women more broadly, the narrative speaks to the universal longing for spaces where vulnerability is met with care rather than exploitation, where confusion is allowed rather than shamed, and where connection is understood as a process rather than a transaction. And by treating Sheena and Natalie's interaction as ethically meaningful rather than provocative, the film underscores its central thesis, that women's relationships with one another, in all their complexity and tenderness, are worthy of serious attention, respect, and care, and that the process of becoming visible to oneself and to others is often catalyzed not by grand gestures but by moments of quiet recognition, shared stories, and the simple yet profound act of being believed. And in this way, Scene 4 stands as a meditation on transition, refuge, and the transformative potential of women-centered connection, offering a vision of intimacy grounded in truth rather than taboo, and affirming the quiet strength that emerges when women are given the space to listen, to speak, and to imagine new possibilities for themselves together.